Hello and welcome to another episode of Reviews Redux, where I take another look at one of my older reviews and bring it up to my more current quality standards. Today I'm taking another look at Star Wars Dark Forces, originally released for PC and PlayStation, and it later got ported over to Mac and Linux with the GOG re-release, which allows you to play on those systems via DOSBox. And what you're seeing here is of course the DOS version. This is a first-person shooter by LucasArts that was released in 1995 for PC and later saw release on PlayStation the following year. And while the PC version was rather well received, the console version wasn't. It had severe problems with the frame rate and the graphical quality that ultimately made it a vastly inferior version to the PC, but to be fair, that's not exactly surprising. Most first-person shooters that got ported over to the PlayStation didn't really perform very well on the PlayStation. At any rate, the game was ultimately a success, and it ended up spawning an entire franchise known as the Dark Forces series, at least up until the sequel's expansion pack. You see, there was Dark Forces, then Dark Forces 2 Jedi Knight, and then from that point on, the rest of the series was just referred to as the Jedi Knight series. So you had Jedi Knight Mysteries of the Sith, Jedi Knight 2 Jedi Outcast, and of course Jedi Knight Jedi Academy. But even though people are starting to forget about the original Dark Forces and are really just referring to that entire series as just Jedi Knight rather than Dark Forces, I'm still one of the old farts who refers to it as the Dark Forces series. Now of course this does play very differently from the later entries in the series. It is a pure first-person shooter. There's no lightsabers, there's no force powers or anything like that. In this one, you're just relying on a vast arsenal of guns to get the job done. And that'll of course raise some questions. If you've played later entries in the series, how do you reconcile not having a lightsaber and force powers? Does it actually end up working? And more importantly, with this being LucasArts' first attempt at a first-person shooter and also running on a brand new engine for the time, how is this as a first-person shooter in general, and does it still hold up all these years later? Well, let's go ahead and start delving right into it and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which runs on the proprietary Jedi engine, which would only power this particular game as well as Outlaws, which is another game that I've already covered on the channel. And as far as the engine's capabilities go, it's closest to the likes of the Build engine in the sense that it is a 2D game, but it's representing 3D space very well in fact, with the ability not only to move in a horizontal plane, but also be able to jump or to fall down a pit or things like that, and even though the game doesn't technically have true 3D environments, it does an extremely convincing job of mimicking them. And with this being a game produced by LucasArts when they were at their absolute best, the graphics in this game for 1995 are absolutely phenomenal. It absolutely oozes Star Wars from every pore, with everything looking exactly as you might expect it would for a proper Star Wars game, even taking into account the limitations of this being a 2D engine and of course all of the characters and weapons and everything being 2D sprites. Said sprite work is rather detailed and holds up very well all these years later, giving it a very nice retro aesthetic at a level of quality that had very few rivals back when this originally released. And there's even animated cutscenes which also use pixel art, but the pixel art is considerably more detailed than the stuff you see when you're just running around and shooting at stuff, and while the animations themselves are a bit static in some ways and aren't especially detailed, having anything of the sort in a first-person shooter circa 1995 was incredibly impressive. And it's a strong reminder that while LucasArts would start to stagnate more towards the 2000s and would eventually just not make video games at all anymore, back in the 90s they were at the forefront of gaming technology, especially with regards to adventure games in the early 90s of course. But of course by the time you get to the mid to late 90s, there's more pseudo 3D and proper 3D once you get games like Quake coming out, and LucasArts was right alongside all of that too, with Dark Forces being one of the prime examples of it. But it wasn't just the visuals and the aesthetics that were impressive for the time, it was also the sound design, which absolutely oozes Star Wars as well. All of the blasters and weaponry sounds exactly like you would expect from Star Wars, although there are some slight oddities with certain sound effects because they hadn't quite standardized everything yet. On top of all of the weapon sounds being suitably Star Wars, all of the aliens sound pretty much exactly like you would expect if you're familiar with the alien lore in Star Wars. And of course, there was the voice acting, which is actually really good for the era. I mean, sure, the audio quality is about as grainy as you would expect for the mid-90s, and the performances aren't perfect. I mean, it's not like there was much professional acting in video games at the time, but that was something LucasArts always excelled at. You could always expect their games to have extremely high quality sound and extremely high quality voice acting for the era, and that tends to hold up very well to this day. And then of course there's the music, another thing that LucasArts always did really well, but in this particular case they took Star Wars soundtracks and turned them into MIDI files. And while it certainly doesn't have quite the same level of impact that the proper orchestrated versions do, it still is really good at helping create that Star Wars atmosphere. And when you bring all of the presentation together, you find that for the time it was released, Dark Forces was pretty much at the top levels of visual quality as well as sound quality, and a lot of that still holds up extremely well to this day, although the audio quality of the voice clips did suffer over the years. But as fantastic as the presentation is, what really matter are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is that you play as Kyle Katarn, a former Imperial officer who has defected and turned mercenary, and when the game starts off, he's on a job working for the Rebel Alliance and specifically was contracted to recover plans for the Death Star. This mission is of course successful, and after providing the plans to the Alliance, they are able to destroy the Death Star. Fast forward about a year, and Kyle is contracted by the Alliance once again, this time to investigate an attack on one of their bases that destroyed the entire base and all of its personnel within minutes. He picks Jan Ors as his mission officer because she's about the only person he actually trusts, and together they go to the base in order to investigate and see what they can find out. They do end up finding some evidence of prototype weaponry that is related to the Dark Trooper project, which aims to create an army of extremely advanced battle droids that will be able to completely wipe out the rebellion once and for all, at least according to the program's supervisor, Ram Malk. And from there, the story follows Kyle as he goes from location to location in search of more information about the Dark Trooper project, and ultimately his attempts to destroy it once and for all. And while the story is ultimately relatively simple and often a bit cheesy, especially with the dialogue, it has a lot of that 90s charm where everything's just a bit over the top, at least for Star Wars anyway, down to things like Kyle being a completely unstoppable juggernaut of death who can basically take on the entire Empire by himself and win, all the while making snarky comments about how either missions are too easy or how this thing that he's going up against that someone's trying to hype up as being terrifying and deadly is really not anywhere near as terrifying or deadly as they make it out to be, all sorts of things like that. And remember, this is all long before he discovers his connection to the Force and starts to get Force powers and use a lightsaber. I mean, really, he's a 90s first-person shooter protagonist. He's just that badass. At any rate, even though the game does have a story, and a fairly complicated one for a first-person shooter from the early to mid-90s, and it does have some surprising amounts of characterization for a first-person shooter of that era, it's really all about the gameplay here, because that's going to be the vast majority of what you're going to be experiencing throughout the entirety of Dark Forces. So how is the gameplay of Dark Forces? Well, it's a 90s first-person shooter, which means that you have a pretty wide arsenal available to you. You don't have any sort of regenerating health or anything like that. You have to find health and armor, or in this case shield pickups scattered around the levels, and you'll be going from level to level, shooting basically anything that gets in your way, and occasionally having to solve a puzzle here and there, mostly things like switch puzzles, along with occasionally needing keys to open the doors that are blocking your progress. Like many first-person shooters of the era, you have an auto map available, so you can consult that if you ever get lost, and that is actually pretty important, because some of these levels are relatively labyrinthine, although for the most part they're certainly not difficult to navigate. There are, however, a couple of exceptions to that rule, namely Anawat City, which is the third level of the game. And even though I've played a ton of first-person shooters over the years and had to endure the misery of sewer levels in quite a lot of them, Anawat City is one of the worst I've ever experienced. In fact, it might actually be the worst, because it consists of navigating your way through sewage tunnels as the sewage itself either pushes you forward in certain instances where there is actually a flow to it, or just serves to slow you down to an absolute crawl, because as you might expect, it severely slows your movement. And on top of that, there are a lot of droids scattered around the area that you have to aim upwards to fight, but there's also a bunch of Dianogas down in the sewage that will just pop up out of nowhere and melee you, and that gets incredibly irritating for reasons I'll discuss in a moment. And there's a bunch of Grans scattered around the area that are throwing thermal detonators at you, and you have to complete a bunch of annoying switch puzzles to progress further into this sewage system, and it's extremely labyrinthine. And I have a feeling that that level alone has turned off a ton of people to Dark Forces as a whole, because it's just that bad. Thankfully, There is a level skip code, so what I would recommend you do, should you decide to play Dark Forces, is to skip that level entirely using the cheat code. And immediately I'm sure I've irritated the living crap out of a bunch of purists, but you know what? I don't really care. Again, it's one of the worst sewer levels I have ever seen, and there is absolutely no shame in skipping it. There is also another particularly irritating level later on that takes place on an ice world, and because of course it's an ice world, there's ice physics all over the place, which means that if you don't want to go slipping and sliding all over the place, you need to find the ice cleats. Thankfully, those are very early in the level, so you don't really need to worry about it, but at the same time, it kind of defeats the point of there being ice physics at all. There are also landmines that are introduced later in the game that can prove extremely irritating because they do a ton of damage, and in some cases, you basically had to know they were there beforehand, otherwise you would just stumble right into them, meaning that certain sections of the game really do come down to a bit of trial and error, which can be pretty irritating. That said, landmines can be destroyed, so it's not a deal breaker or anything, but it can be pretty irritating when you go into certain levels and they have a ton of landmines. So for the most part, the levels aren't that difficult to navigate, it's just that certain levels are particularly irritating compared to others, and for the most part, the level design is pretty acceptable to outright good. But what about the rest of the game? Well, there's a pretty good selection of weapons available to you, from the basic Briar blaster pistol that you start with, on up through things like, of course, the Stormtrooper rifle, which is just a more rapid-fire blaster rifle, on to things like thermal detonators, which are basically just hand grenades, on up to things like the Imperial Repeater, which is more or less the game's equivalent of a machine gun, or even things like the Concussion rifle, which launches an blast of energy that does an absolutely massive amount of damage, and some of these weapons actually have secondary fire functions. So for example, the basic blaster pistol only has the one fire mode, but the Imperial Repeater has the steady stream of shots with the primary fire, and the secondary fire shoots a triangle pattern of 3 bolts. And that's both interesting because of course it adds a bit of extra variety to the weapons, but it also was something you didn't really see a whole lot of at the time. There were certainly other games doing secondary fire functions, but they were rather few and far between, so Dark Forces did set itself apart in that regard. Now that said, most of the secondary fire functions really aren't all that useful outside of the assault cannon, which has a missile launcher as its secondary fire, so that's extremely useful, but all the other secondary fire functions are either very situational or outright non-existent. Not all of the weapons have them, after all. As for the weapons themselves, in a manner similar to the original Doom and Doom 2, some of the weapons do share ammunition. Specifically, the blaster pistol and blaster rifle both share energy units, and the ammunition type power cells is shared by the concussion rifle, the plasma cutter, and the Imperial Repeater. All of the other weapons have their own individual ammunition types, and the assault cannon has 2 ammunition types, specifically the plasma shells that you'll be using as the primary fire, as well as the missiles that you use as the secondary fire. And of course, this being a classic 90s shooter, there is no reloading at all. You'll notice down at the bottom right, your ammunition is counted in big red numbers, and there's a small number above that, which counts the amount of secondary ammunition you have. And then above that, there are 5 green pips, which represent the amount of battery energy you have, and that is used to power things like the IR goggles, or your headlamp, or a couple of other items. Meanwhile, on the left side of the screen, you have your health shields and the number of lives you have. You see, this is not a typical first-person shooter from the era in the sense that you don't have quick saves, and you don't have any sort of way to save while you're in a mission. Instead, you have a number of lives that are to the right of the number displaying the amount of health you have, and whenever your health bottoms out and you die, you just respawn shortly before wherever you were, and you basically end up losing absolutely no progress with the revives, and you actually end up starting back at full health and 100 shields. As you might expect, extra lives are hidden in various secret areas around the levels, so it does behoove you to go around and explore and see if you can find those secret areas, on top of course getting extra ammo, shields, and health. You might also find a couple of power-ups in these secret areas, or sometimes not even in secret areas. Specifically, you will find weapon overcharges and shield overcharges, both of which will last for a surprisingly long amount of time, and during which you will have one of two effects depending on which one you've picked up. The weapon overcharge causes all of your weapons to fire at a considerably faster rate, whereas the shield overcharge is basically just an invulnerability power-up. There's also an item called the Revive, which is a very rare item that replenishes all of your health and shields back to absolute maximum. And they're actually rather strategically placed in the sense that wherever you find one, you probably need it. You see, even though this game is not especially difficult due to things like the shields taking all incoming damage from energy weapons and such up to a certain point before it'll start affecting your health, as well as of course the lives system and the power-ups you can get, this is still a relatively challenging game at times, and you do need to be pretty careful with it, especially on the higher difficulty levels. And it also takes a lot of getting used to compared to the likes of, say, Doom or Duke Nukem or something along those lines, which tend to have a fair amount of hit scan weapons that make it easy to shoot things from a distance. Here you do actually need to do some compensation for the fact that the vast majority of weapons in this game are projectile based, and the ones that aren't just have a delay between when you shoot and when they actually hit something. And while the game does have some degree of auto-aim and is actually relatively generous in that regard for its era, that does only go so far, and you do still need to aim up and down to be able to hit certain enemies. And you do also need to be rather careful with the thermal detonators because it has a rather steep arc of being thrown, so you do need to compensate for that as well. But once you get used to all of that, you're going to very quickly find that Dark Forces is one of the best first-person shooters of its era, not just one of the best Star Wars games of its era. I mean, don't get me wrong, the third level of the game is one of the most miserable things you can put yourself through in an old-school first-person shooter, and the landmines are very finicky with the hit detection where you're trying to throw grenades at them in order to detonate them without you wandering right into them. And there's only a limited amount of mouse look to where you can use the mouse to look around on the horizontal plane, but if you want to look up and down, you still have to use the keyboard. So that's a bit awkward, but to be fair, at the time, that was a relatively new thing, so they hadn't quite figured everything out yet as far as controls go. But even with those issues, again, it's one of the best first-person shooters and Star Wars games of its era, and it holds up extremely well to this day. I mean, it would certainly be nice if we had full mouse controls, and there was a source port in the works called Dark XL, but it's nowhere near finished, and the project seems to have completely stalled out, unfortunately. So if you're wanting to play Dark Forces, the best option is still just to play it through DOSBox, and it does work perfectly fine through that, although it's best if you go in and modify some of the key commands in the setup. And if you're curious on how to do that, I might actually do a separate short video just showing how you do something like that in an old school game like this, because it occurs to me that many of you out there may not actually know how to do it. But suffice to say, if you're a fan of old school first-person shooters, or a fan of Star Wars, or especially if you're a fan of both, you'll definitely want to give Dark Forces a try. It's still a very eminently playable game, and it is still readily available on the likes of GOG and Steam. And if you're interested in picking up a copy of this for yourself, I will of course have links in the description box to both the GOG and Steam releases. And if you're curious about the Jedi Knight series, which is really just the rest of the Dark Forces series, I'll certainly be taking another look at those eventually as well. I reviewed them all already, but I do plan on doing reduxes of those, much like I did with Dark Forces here. Thank you all very much for watching, and if you like the kind of videos I make, then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Everything from that goes directly back into the channel, whether it be getting additional games for review, or additional equipment, or replacing equipment, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine, I understand. But the option is there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.